Right now, off the coast of Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, scientists have confirmed something that has never been directly observed anywhere on Earth before. A tectonic plate actively breaking apart in real time as it dives beneath the North American continent. Not breaking apart the way you might picture, a single dramatic crack splitting the plate cleanly in two, but tearing itself into pieces one section at a time, like a train slowly coming off the rails, car by car, instead of all at once. And in the middle of this same stretch of ocean floor, a completely different team of researchers just confirmed the existence of a piece of ancient seafloor that vanished from the geological record roughly 30 million years ago and has just resurfaced in the data, sitting directly beneath one of the most seismically dangerous junctions in the entire country. Two separate, peer-reviewed discoveries, published only months apart. And together they're forcing scientists to redraw the map of exactly what's moving beneath the Pacific Northwest coast. Let's break down exactly what was confirmed, what it actually means for earthquake risk in this region, and why the picture here just got significantly more complicated than anyone expected. Subscribe to the channel before we get into this one, because I cover exactly this kind of confirmed, published geological research the moment it comes. Out, not months later once it's already old news. Let's start with the basic geography, because you need to understand the setup here before the discoveries themselves make sense. Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest sits the Cascadia Subduction Zone, a stretch of plate boundary running from Cape Mendocino in Northern California all the way north to Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Along this boundary, two oceanic plates, the Juan de Fuca Plate and its smaller southern neighbor, the Gorda Plate, are being forced underneath the much larger North American plate in a process called subduction. Both of these plates are remnants of a much larger ancient plate called the Farallon Plate, which used to cover an enormous stretch of the eastern Pacific Ocean before most of it was consumed by subduction over tens of millions of years, leaving these two comparatively small fragments still grinding their way underneath the continent today. According to the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, this exact tectonic system is capable of producing earthquakes at magnitude 9, 0 or larger, the same category of earthquake that produced the devastating 2011 Tohoku disaster in Japan. This is the fault system behind what's often referred to as the Pacific Northwest's own version of the big one. Now, here's where things get genuinely fascinating, because scientists have spent decades assuming they had a reasonably complete picture of how these plates behave as they sink into the Earth. Using advanced seismic imaging techniques, essentially building a three-dimensional picture of what's happening deep underground by analyzing how seismic waves from earthquakes travel through different rock structures, researchers were able to directly observe the Juan de Fuca Plate splitting into distinct fragments as it descends beneath North America. This finding, published in the journal Science Advances, represents the first time scientists have ever directly observed an active subduction zone breaking apart in this manner anywhere on the planet. Rather than the plate collapsing or tearing all at once in a single catastrophic event, researchers found the breakup happens in stages, through what they're calling episodic or piecewise termination. The plate tears apart one section at a time, and the timing for each individual piece to fully break away takes several million years. Researchers describe this process using a genuinely helpful analogy. Picture a runaway train. Instead of the entire train crashing all at once, individual cars are being cut loose one at a time, and each time a car detaches, the remaining train loses a bit of momentum. Applied to the plate itself, each time a fragment breaks away and forms what geologists call a microplate, a smaller independently moving piece of what used to be one continuous slab, the larger plate loses some of the gravitational pull that was dragging it downward, gradually reducing the forces driving the whole subduction system. Over a long enough timeline, this piece-by-piece breakup can eventually contribute to shutting an entire subduction system down entirely, something that has clearly happened elsewhere in Earth's geological history, since this same research helps explain puzzling features found in other ancient, now abandoned subduction zones around the world, including orphaned tectonic fragments and unexplained bursts of ancient volcanic activity that geologists have puzzled over for years. I want to be clear about something important here because I think it's genuinely easy to hear the plate is breaking apart and assume that automatically means something catastrophic and imminent. It doesn't, at least not on any timeline that matters to anyone alive today. This is a process playing out over millions of years. And the article reporting on this discovery in Columbia University's Climate News publication specifically emphasized that this breakup isn't necessarily bad news in the way the phrase might initially suggest. What it actually represents is scientists finally being able to directly observe, with real data, a process that had previously only been inferred indirectly from the geological record left behind by ancient, long-since vanished subduction zones. This is a genuine leap forward in understanding how these systems behave, not a countdown clock to disaster. But that's only half of what's been confirmed recently, and the second discovery is arguably even more significant for understanding earthquake hazards specifically. In January of this year, a completely separate team of researchers published new findings in the journal Science, focused not on the broader Cascadia system, but specifically on the Mendocino triple junction, the exact point off the coast of Northern California, where three major tectonic plates, the Pacific Plate, the North American Plate, and the Gorda Plate, all converge simultaneously. This is widely considered one of the most geologically complex and most seismically active locations anywhere in North America, precisely because you have three separate plates all interacting and grinding against each other in the same relatively confined area. Using data gathered from thousands of tiny, otherwise unremarkable earthquakes, the kind far too weak for anyone to ever feel, researchers built an entirely new model of what's actually happening beneath this junction. And what they found genuinely surprised even seasoned geologists in the field. Buried beneath this junction, researchers confirmed the existence of what they're calling the Pioneer fragment, a leftover piece of that same ancient Farallon plate we talked about earlier, a chunk of oceanic crust that geologists believed had disappeared beneath North America roughly 30 million years ago and essentially vanished from any relevance to modern tectonics. It hadn't vanished. It had simply been sitting there, largely unnoticed, stuck to the floor of the Pacific Ocean, and it's now being dragged northwest beneath the continent as the Pacific Plate continues its overall motion, essentially hitching a ride embedded within the seafloor as the larger plate carries it along. That alone would be a significant discovery on its own. But researchers identified something else buried in the same dataset that may be even more important from a hazard perspective. A separate fragment, this one broken off from the North American Plate itself rather than from the ancient Farallon system, has also detached from the main body of the continent and is now sinking downward alongside the Gorda Plate as it subducts. Put together, this means that where classic geological maps of this region have long shown just three simple interacting tectonic plates, researchers have now confirmed at least 5 separate, independently moving pieces of crust, all interacting beneath this one junction. The Pacific Plate, the North American Plate, the Gorda Plate, the Pioneer fragment, and this newly identified, detached chunk of North American Plate sinking alongside the Gorda slab. Here's why that number matters so much for earthquake hazard modeling specifically. Every additional independently moving piece of crust in a system like this represents another surface where stress can build up, another boundary where two pieces of rock can grind against each, other and eventually slip in an earthquake, and another variable that seismic hazard models have to account for when trying to estimate how large a future earthquake in this region could be and exactly where it might rupture. A system with 3 simple, well-understood interacting plates is already complicated. A system that turns out to actually contain 5 separate moving pieces, 2 of which weren't even confirmed to exist until this year, is a meaningfully more complex puzzle. And every additional piece of that puzzle represents additional uncertainty that scientists now need to work through. This isn't purely theoretical either. We already have real-world seismic evidence of exactly this kind of internal complexity playing out. Back in December of 2022, a magnitude 6, 4 earthquakes struck near Ferndale, California, close to the same triple junction region. When researchers from the USGS later analyzed the seismic and geodetic signatures of that earthquake and its aftershock sequence in detail, they found something genuinely revealing. The main shock itself occurred as strike-slip faulting, essentially a sideways grinding motion, within the subducting Gorda slab itself, rather than along the main subduction interface where the Gorda Plate meets North America. That detail matters enormously because it demonstrates directly that the Gorda Plate isn't behaving like a single, rigid, uniform slab of rock as it subducts. It's a plate that experiences what geologists call significant intraplate deformation, meaning it's genuinely breaking and shifting internally, generating its own independent earthquakes from stresses building up within the plate itself, separate entirely from the stress building up along the main subduction boundary where the really large, potentially magnitude 9 earthquakes are expected to eventually occur. Researchers studying the Ferndale sequence also found something else worth mentioning: small but measurable deformation after the main earthquake that was best explained by slow aseismic slip, meaning gradual movement without producing its own earthquake, occurring specifically on the main subduction interface, apparently triggered by stress changes generated by the Ferndale rupture itself. That finding demonstrates these different fault systems, the intraplate faults within the Gorda slab and the main subduction interface itself, aren't behaving as completely separate independent systems. They're interacting with each other, one system's activity capable of nudging stress onto the other, which is exactly the kind of coupled behavior that makes hazard forecasting in this region considerably more complicated than treating each fault as an isolated, self-contained hazard. There's one more piece of context worth understanding here. because it extends the potential significance of this research beyond just the immediate Cascadia and Mendocino region. Some existing scientific evidence suggests that a major earthquake along the Cascadia Subduction Zone could potentially trigger subsequent earthquakes along the San Andreas Fault further south, a possibility that would meaningfully widen the geographic footprint of danger beyond what's traditionally been modeled as two largely separate fault systems. The San Andreas Fault itself directly abuts the southern end of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, right around this same triple junction area, with the Pacific and North American plates grinding past, each other in a transform side-by-side motion along the San Andreas, while just to the north at Cascadia, the Juan de Fuca and Gorda plates are diving directly beneath the continent in a completely different style of tectonic motion. Having confirmed this, much additional structural complexity, sitting right at the exact junction where these two very different fault systems meet, only reinforces why researchers are increasingly treating this entire region as a single interconnected system, rather than analyzing Cascadia and the San Andreas as though they operate in complete geological isolation from one another. So let's step back and talk about what all of this actually means in practical terms, because I think it's genuinely important to separate the significance of the science from any implication that something dangerous is suddenly newly imminent. What's been confirmed here is not evidence that an earthquake is more likely tomorrow than it was last year. What's been confirmed is that the underlying structure of this fault system is meaningfully more complex than the model scientists have been using for decades, and that complexity matters enormously for the accuracy of long-term hazard assessments, the kind that inform building codes, insurance risk models, and emergency preparedness planning across the entire Pacific Northwest. Every time researchers identify an additional moving fragment, an additional zone of internal deformation within a plate that was previously modeled as rigid, or additional evidence that separate fault systems are mechanically coupled rather than independent, that new information eventually works its way into updated hazard maps and updated probability estimates for how large a future rupture along this coastline could actually be. This is exactly how earthquake science has always progressed, incrementally, through exactly this kind of painstaking analysis of tiny, otherwise unremarkable earthquakes and advanced imaging techniques that simply didn't exist a generation ago. The fact that scientists are still discovering fundamental new structural features of the Cascadia system in 2025 and 2026 in one of the most extensively studied subduction zones on the entire planet tells you something genuinely humbling about how much complexity remains buried beneath even our best mapped fault systems. If you live anywhere along the Pacific Northwest coast from Northern California up through Oregon, Washington, and into British Columbia, this research is a good reminder to make sure your own earthquake preparedness reflects the genuine, well-established risk this region already carries, rather than reacting to headlines suggesting something has suddenly changed for the worse overnight. The Cascadia Subduction Zone has been capable of producing a magnitude 9 earthquake for as long as it's existed, and that fundamental risk hasn't increased because scientists just got better at seeing the structure underlying it. What has genuinely improved is our understanding of exactly how that risk is distributed and how these different fault systems interact with each other, which over time will make emergency planning and building codes more accurately targeted at the specific hazards this region actually faces. If you haven't reviewed your own earthquake preparedness recently, this is a good moment to do it. Know whether your home has been retrofitted to current seismic standards, particularly if you're in an older structure. Have a basic emergency kit ready with water, food, and medical supplies to last at least several days, since a major Cascadia rupture could disrupt infrastructure and transportation routes across a wide swath of the region simultaneously, unlike a more localized single-fault earthquake. And if you live near the coast specifically, know your tsunami evacuation route in advance, since a major rupture along this subduction zone would generate a tsunami with extremely limited warning time for coastal communities sitting closest to the fault itself. I'll keep tracking research coming out of this region closely, because between the confirmed piecewise breakup of the Juan de Fuca Plate and the newly identified Pioneer fragment and detached North American chunk at the Mendocino triple junction, this is clearly an area of active, rapidly evolving scientific understanding right now, and I would not be surprised at all to see additional discoveries revise this picture further within the next year or two. The moment anything significant comes out of continued research here, or if seismic activity in the region shows any meaningful change tied to what we just walked through, I'll bring you a complete update. Subscribe so you don't miss that follow-up, and drop a comment below if you live anywhere along the Pacific Northwest coast, and let me know whether you've already got an earthquake kit and evacuation plan in place, or if this is the video that's finally pushing you to put one together. I read every one of these, and I genuinely think hearing from people who actually live with this risk day to day helps everyone else watching understand what all of this science actually means for real communities, not just for the research papers themselves. Stay curious about what's happening beneath your feet. Because as this research just proved, even the most studied fault systems on Earth are still revealing secrets. I will see you in the next one.